The arena went silent the moment Elara stepped past the velvet rope, because everyone in that crowd knew she was breaking a rule that had never been broken before. Her boots pressed into the frozen dirt of the courtyard, and every eye in the kingdom of Ashwood Hollow turned toward her, waiting to see if she would really do what the whispers already claimed she was about to do. She did not slow down. She did not look back at the golden platform where King Draven sat with his arms crossed, a crown of black iron resting on his head like a promise of control. She kept walking, straight toward the far end of the courtyard, where a single figure stood apart from every other suitor gathered for the choosing. This was the day every unmated woman in the kingdom feared and hoped for at once. Once a year, when the frost came early and the moon hung low over the stone towers of Ashwood Hollow, the Alpha King gathered every eligible rogue and warrior into one courtyard, so the unmated Omegas could select a protector. It was called the Choosing, and it had existed for 300 years without a single surprise, because King Draven always made sure the outcome was decided long before the ceremony began. He handpicked which suitors were allowed to stand in the circle. He whispered promises to the ones he wanted chosen and quietly dismissed the ones he did not. For Elara, he had already arranged everything. She was meant to walk toward Theo, a quiet, obedient rogue with soft eyes and no ambition, a man who would keep her exactly where the king wanted her, powerless and unnoticed. But Elara was looking at someone else entirely. At the far corner of the courtyard, chained to an iron post driven deep into the frozen ground, stood a man the guards called nothing but the Beast. He wore no title, no name that anyone dared to use aloud. His wrists were bound in cold metal, his jaw covered by a muzzle of leather and steel, and his eyes, when they lifted to meet hers, held something that made her breath catch in her throat. It was not madness, it was not the mindless violence the rumors described. It was recognition, sharp and immediate, as though he had been waiting for her long before she ever knew he existed. His name, whispered only in fear, was Kale. 3 years earlier, Kale had been the reason mothers pulled their children inside before sundown. He had torn apart an entire pack in a single night, according to the stories told around fires and taverns, stories that grew more terrifying with every retelling. Some said he had gone mad from the moon's pull. Others said he had simply been born wrong, cursed with too much strength and not enough restraint. King Draven had ordered him captured rather than killed, not out of mercy, but because a living monster made a far more useful warning than a dead one. Every year at the Choosing, Kale was brought out in chains and displayed like a lesson. This is what happens to those who cannot control themselves. This is what the kingdom does to monsters. No Omega had ever walked toward him, not once, in 3 years. Elara did. She could feel the murmurs rising behind her like a wave building before it crashes, whispers turning into gasps, gasps sharpening into disbelief. Somewhere behind her, she heard Theo's voice crack as he called her name, confused, hurt, publicly humiliated in front of the entire kingdom. She did not turn around for him either. Her focus stayed fixed on the chained man ahead of her, on the way his shoulders tensed as she closed the distance between them, as if he were bracing for her to stop, to laugh, to turn away like everyone always did. She did not stop. When she reached him, she was close enough to see the details no one else ever bothered to notice. The scars along his forearms were too precise, too deliberate to have come from a battle. They looked instead like the marks left behind by something far more calculated than violence. His eyes, though sharp and wary, were not empty the way the stories claimed. They were exhausted. They were the eyes of someone who had been fighting something invisible for a very long time and had simply run out of places to hide from it. Elara. Her father's old friend Grace, a healer who had raised her since her own parents' deaths, pushed through the crowd, her voice trembling with warning. Elara, step back, please. Elara did not step back. Behind her, on the golden platform, King Draven finally rose to his feet. He was a tall man, broad through the shoulders, with silver threading through dark hair, and a voice that had commanded obedience for over 2 decades. His territory stretched across half the northern hills, and no one, not even his own advisors, questioned his decisions without consequence. He looked down at Elara now with an expression caught somewhere between amusement and disbelief, as though he assumed this was some kind of misstep, a young woman confused by nerves. "You have made an error," he called out, his voice carrying easily across the silent courtyard. "The suitor you are looking for stands on the other side. Theo is waiting for you." Elara turned then, finally, to face the king directly. Her voice, when it came, was steady in a way that surprised even her. "I have not made an error, my king. I have made my choice." A ripple of shocked whispers spread through the gathered crowd. No one interrupted the king, no one contradicted him in open court. Draven's jaw tightened, the amusement draining from his face and replaced with something colder. You cannot choose him, Draven said, gesturing toward Kael as though the very idea offended him. He is not a suitor. He is a prisoner kept alive as a warning. There is no honor in that chain, girl. Choose again. The law of the choosing says any unmated Omega may select any unmated male present in the circle, Alara said. And though her heart pounded hard enough that she feared everyone could hear it, her voice did not waver. He stands in the circle. He is unmated. I am choosing him. Kael, still silent, still bound, watched this exchange with an intensity that made the surrounding guards shift uneasily. He had not spoken a single word in 3 years, not to his captors, not to the healers who occasionally checked whether his wounds had closed, not even when the leather muzzle was removed for feeding. Some believed he had lost the ability to speak entirely, that whatever had broken inside him during his capture had taken his voice along with his freedom. But now, as Alara stood before him refusing to be moved, something flickered across his face that had not been there in all the years the guards had watched him. It was not gratitude. It was something closer to disbelief, as though he could not understand why anyone would choose to stand this close to him voluntarily. Draven's hands curled into fists at his sides. This is madness. He is dangerous. He nearly destroyed an entire settlement. You would put yourself at his mercy? With respect, my king, Alara said. The law does not ask whether a suitor is convenient. It asks whether he stands in the circle unmated. He does. I have made my choice, and I will not take it back. For a long, heavy moment, the courtyard held its breath. Draven's advisors leaned close to whisper urgent warnings in his ear. Somewhere in the crowd, Theo stood frozen, his face pale, his dreams of a quiet, easy mate crumbling in front of an audience of hundreds. Grace gripped the edge of her shawl so tightly her knuckles turned white, silently praying that Alara understood exactly what she was risking. Alara understood better than any of them realized. She had spent her entire life being underestimated, first as an orphan daughter of a pack destroyed in a border conflict she barely remembered, then as a quiet young woman who kept to the edges of gatherings, watching more than speaking. People assumed her silence meant weakness. They assumed her calm meant she had nothing worth saying. She had let them believe it, because it was easier than fighting expectations that were never going to change through argument alone. But she had watched, for years, the way King Draven arranged every outcome in Ashwood Hollow to serve his own comfort, the way he chose winners and losers long before anyone else was allowed input, the way strength was punished if it threatened his control, and rewarded only when it served him. She had watched Kael too, from a distance, every year at the choosing. She had seen the way his eyes tracked everything happening around him with total clarity, nothing like the mindless creature the rumors described. She had noticed the careful way he avoided provoking his guards, not out of fear, but out of some quiet, controlled discipline that made her wonder what kind of man had truly stood in that circle before the chains ever touched his wrists. King Draven stared at her for a long moment, weighing his options in front of a crowd that had already witnessed his authority questioned once tonight. To refuse her outright would break the ancient law of the choosing in front of every noble family present, something that would cost him more standing than he wanted to admit. To allow it would mean releasing the one creature he had spent 3 years keeping safely contained. You do not know what you are asking for, he said finally, quieter now, meant only for her ears, though several guards standing nearby still caught the words. He is not simply dangerous. He is unpredictable. Even I cannot promise what he will do once those chains come off. Then perhaps, Alara answered. No one has ever actually asked him. Draven's eyes narrowed at that, something calculating shifting behind them, though he said nothing more. He turned instead to his guards, giving a sharp, reluctant gesture. Bring the healer. Have the girl examined for injuries before nightfall, in case this ends the way I expect it to. It was as close to acknowledgement as Alara was going to get. The crowd began to stir again, murmurs rising into full conversation as people processed what they had just witnessed. Theo was quietly ushered away by an attendant, his humiliation folded into whispered comfort meant to spare him further embarrassment. Grace hurried to Alara's side, gripping her arm with trembling fingers. Do you understand what you have done? Grace whispered, her eyes darting toward Kael, who remained motionless, watching everything with quiet, careful attention. That man has not spoken since they brought him here. No one knows what happens when those chains finally come undone. I know exactly what I have done, Alara said, though her pulse was racing harder than she wanted to admit. She turned back toward Kael, meeting his gaze one more time before the guards began moving to escort her away for the mandatory examination all newly chosen Omegas underwent. His eyes followed her, sharp and unreadable, and for one brief moment, something in his expression softened, Just slightly. Just enough for her to notice. It was not the look of a monster. It was the look of someone who had been waiting a very long time for anyone at all to see him as something other than a warning carved into iron chains, and who did not yet trust himself to believe that she truly meant what she had just done in front of the entire kingdom. As Grace led her away from the courtyard, Elara allowed herself one last glance over her shoulder. Cale remained where he stood, chained to the post, surrounded by guards who watched him the way one watches something that might, at any moment, remember exactly how much strength it still had left inside it. But his eyes were not on the guards. They were on her, following her retreat across the frozen courtyard until the crowd finally closed the distance between them. Ashwood Hollow had never seen a choosing like this one, and by morning, every corner of the kingdom would know that the quiet, overlooked orphan girl had done what no one else ever dared. She had walked past every safe, approved suitor in the circle and chosen the one man the entire kingdom had been taught to fear the most. What none of them yet understood, not Grace, not Theo, not even King Draven himself sitting rigid and furious on his golden platform, was that Elara had not chosen Cale out of foolishness or rebellion alone. She had chosen him because, somewhere beneath the fear and the chains and the years of silence, she had recognized something the rest of the kingdom refused to see. A man who had never truly been given the chance to be anything other than the monster they had decided he was. That recognition, small and quiet as it was about to change everything. The healer's chamber smelled of dried lavender and boiled herbs, but Elara barely noticed the scent as Grace checked her pulse for the third time in an hour, muttering under her breath about recklessness and pride. Outside the small stone building, the courtyard had emptied of its crowd, but the tension from the choosing still hung in the air like smoke that refused to clear. Word had already begun spreading through the kingdom, carried by servants and guards who had witnessed the event firsthand, twisting a little more with every retelling, until the story sounded far more dramatic than the truth already was. "You are shaking," Grace said, setting down the small brass instrument she used to measure heartbeat and breath. "You may pretend to be calm in front of the king, but you cannot pretend in front of me. I have known you since you were small enough to fit in my arms after your parents' pack fell." "I am not afraid of him," Elara said quietly, though she understood Grace was not asking about fear alone. "Then you are the first person in 3 years who is not," Grace replied, folding her hands in her lap. "Do you understand what you have taken on tonight? The moment those chains are removed, there is no ceremony, no guard rotation, no law that can protect you if something goes wrong. You will be bonded to a man that even King Draven, for all his cruelty, has been too cautious to release." Elara considered her answer carefully before speaking. She had spent the walk from the courtyard turning the same thought over in her mind, trying to understand exactly why she had done what she did. It had not been impulsive, not truly, even though it had certainly looked that way to everyone watching. She had noticed Cale for years, quietly, the way she noticed most things others overlooked. She remembered the first choosing she had attended as an observer, long before she was old enough to be chosen herself, and the way the crowd had gasped and recoiled at the sight of him standing chained at the edge of the circle. She remembered how young he had looked even then, how the fear in the crowd seemed disproportionate to the silent, watchful figure standing among them. "He has not hurt anyone since they captured him," Elara said finally. "Not one person, not one guard, not one healer sent to examine him. If he were truly the mindless creature everyone describes, do you not think that would have happened by now?" Grace hesitated, clearly having no immediate answer for that. "Perhaps he is simply waiting." "Or perhaps," Elara said, "he has been given every reason to stay quiet, and none at all to trust anyone enough to speak." Before Grace could respond, a sharp knock interrupted them, and one of King Draven's personal guards stepped into the chamber without waiting for permission. His expression was tight, controlled in the way of someone delivering unwelcome news. "The king requests your presence," he said to Elara. "The prisoner is being unchained tonight, under guard, in accordance with the law you invoked. The king wishes you present, to witness the terms." Elara rose immediately, ignoring Grace's hand reaching out to stop her. She followed the guard out of the healer's chamber and across the darkened courtyard toward the lower holding cells built into the base of the eastern tower, a place she had only ever heard described in whispers, never seen with her own eyes. The air grew colder as they descended a narrow stone staircase, torches flickering against damp walls, until they reached a heavy iron door guarded by 4 armed men, who straightened immediately at the sight of the king's insignia on the approaching guard's uniform. Inside, the chamber was small and windowless, lit only by a single torch mounted near the door. Cale sat on a low stone bench, still chained at the wrists and ankles, though the leather muzzle had finally been removed. Up close, without the crowd and the ceremony surrounding him, he looked different than he had in the courtyard. Younger, somehow, despite the hardened lines around his eyes. His dark hair fell longer than the guards typically allowed prisoners to keep, and there were fresh bruises along his jaw that had clearly come from something recent, something no one had bothered to explain. King Draven stood near the far wall, arms crossed, his expression unreadable in the flickering torchlight. "You wish to see the terms," Draven said without turning immediately toward her. "Here they are. He will be unchained tonight, under the supervision of 6 guards who will remain stationed outside your quarters at all times. Should anything happen to you, anything at all, he will be executed immediately, without trial, without ceremony. Do you understand what you are agreeing to?" "I understand," Ilara said. Draven finally turned to look at her directly. "Then you also understand that I am not doing this out of respect for your choice. I am doing this because the law leaves me no alternative, and because I intend to prove, very quickly, that this was a mistake you will regret." Ilara held his gaze without flinching, something that seemed to surprise him more than he wanted to show. Behind Draven, Kael watched the exchange in silence, his chained hands resting loosely in his lap, his eyes moving between the king and Ilara with the same careful, calculating attention she had noticed in the courtyard. Draven gave a sharp nod to the guard standing near the door. "Remove the chains, now, while I am here to witness it." The guards approached cautiously, clearly uneasy despite their numbers, and began working the heavy iron locks free from Kael's wrists and ankles. Ilara watched his face throughout the process, expecting some flicker of relief or anger, but instead, she saw only stillness, a carefully controlled blankness that told her far more about the years he had endured than any outburst could have. When the final chain fell away, Kael did not move. He remained seated exactly where he had been, hands now free in his lap, eyes lowered toward the stone floor. The guards stepped back immediately, weapons half raised, clearly expecting some kind of violent reaction that never came. "Stand," Draven ordered. Kael rose slowly, deliberately, his movements controlled in a way that seemed almost deliberate, as though he understood exactly how closely he was being watched and had decided, for reasons of his own, not to give anyone a reason to react. Standing at his full height for the first time without chains weighing him down, he was taller than Ilara had realized, broad through the shoulders, carrying himself with a quiet, contained strength that had nothing to do with the wild violence the rumors described. "You will follow the girl to her quarters," Draven said. "You will not speak to anyone outside her presence. You will not leave the Eastern Wing without an escort, and you will remember, every single moment, that 6 armed guards stand ready outside her door, and that your life depends entirely on nothing going wrong." Kael said nothing. He simply inclined his head slightly, an acknowledgement rather than agreement, and Draven seemed to accept this as the only response he was going to receive. The walk from the holding cell to Ilara's quarters in the Eastern Wing felt longer than it should have. The corridors lined with silent guards who watched Kael pass with wary, suspicious eyes. Ilara walked slightly ahead of him, aware of his presence behind her the entire way, though he made no attempt to close the distance or speak. When they finally reached her quarters, a modest set of rooms she had lived in since arriving in Ashwood Hollow years earlier, the guards took their positions outside the door exactly as promised, and Ilara stepped inside with Kael following a careful step behind. The room fell silent once the door closed behind them, leaving the two of them alone together for the first time, without chains, crowds, or a king dictating every movement between them. Kael remained near the door, his posture still tense despite the freedom of his limbs, his eyes scanning the room methodically, as though cataloging every exit, every potential threat, every detail his years of captivity had trained him to notice. "You do not have to stand there all night," Ilara said softly, breaking the silence first. Kael's eyes shifted toward her, and for a long moment, he said nothing at all, exactly as he had for 3 years according to every account she had ever heard. But then, quietly, hesitantly, in a voice rough from disuse, he finally spoke the first words anyone outside his captors had heard from him in years. "Why did you choose me?" The question hung in the air between them, simple and direct, carrying far more weight than its brevity suggested. Ilara considered her answer carefully, unwilling to offer empty comfort or false reassurance to a man who had clearly grown suspicious of both. "Because everyone else in that courtyard saw a monster," she said, "and I did not." Kael's jaw tightened, something flickering behind his eyes that looked almost like disbelief, as though he could not quite accept the simplicity of her answer. "You do not know what I have done." "I know what they say you have done," Ilara replied. "I do not know if any of it is true." For the first time since the chains had come off, something shifted in Cale's expression, the careful blankness cracking just slightly to reveal something rawer underneath, something that looked dangerously close to hope, quickly suppressed and hidden away again before it could fully surface. "It is safer for you," he said quietly, "if you continue to believe what they say." "Perhaps," Elara said, "but I did not choose safety tonight. I chose you." Cale did not respond immediately. Instead, he moved slowly toward the small window on the far side of the room, looking out at the darkened courtyard below, where the last of the torches were being extinguished for the night. Elara watched him carefully, noting the tension still held in his shoulders, the careful, measured way he moved, as though constantly bracing for something to go wrong. "They will be watching every moment," he said finally, still facing the window, "waiting for me to prove them right. Then we will simply have to prove them wrong," Elara said. Cale turned to look at her then, and in the dim candlelight of the room, something passed between them that neither of them fully understood yet, a quiet recognition that whatever came next, they were no longer facing it entirely alone. Outside the door, the guards shifted in the darkness, weapons ready, waiting for the moment everyone still expected would come. But inside the room, for the first time in 3 years, Cale allowed himself to breathe without the weight of chains holding him down, and Elara realized, watching him, that whatever the kingdom believed about the monster she had chosen, the truth was still waiting to be discovered, one quiet moment at a time. Morning came with a knock sharp enough to wake the entire eastern wing, and Elara opened her eyes to find one of the palace attendants already waiting outside her door, her face pale with urgency. "The king requests your presence immediately," the attendant said. "There has been an incident." Elara sat up quickly, glancing toward the corner of the room where Cale had spent the night seated near the window, refusing the small cot she had offered him, his eyes never fully closing despite the exhaustion clearly written across his face. He was already alert, watching the doorway with the same careful attention he had shown since the chains came off. "What kind of incident?" Elara asked. "I do not know the details," the attendant said. "Only that the king wants you in the throne hall within the hour, and that you should bring him with you." Her eyes flicked briefly toward Cale, quickly darting away again. By the time Elara arrived in the throne hall, dressed hastily and still gathering her thoughts, she found the room already crowded with advisors, guards, and several nobles whose families held significant influence across Ashwood Hollow's northern territories. King Draven sat rigid on his throne, his expression carved from stone, and beside him stood a woman Elara recognized as one of the senior council members, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "There you are," Draven said, his voice cutting through the murmurs filling the hall. "Perhaps you can explain why, less than 12 hours after I released a dangerous prisoner into your care, one of my personal guards was found unconscious near the eastern wing." Elara felt her stomach tighten. "I do not understand." "Cale was with me the entire night. He never left my sight." "That is precisely the problem," Draven said. "You claim he never left, yet somehow, one of my most trusted guards was attacked outside your quarters, struck hard enough to lose consciousness for hours." Behind Elara, Cale's expression had gone carefully blank again, though she noticed the subtle tension returning to his shoulders, the same defensive stillness she had seen in the holding cell the night before. "I did not touch your guard," Cale said quietly, his voice steady despite the weight of every eye in the hall turning toward him. "Convenient," Draven replied coldly. "A man capable of destroying an entire pack single-handedly, and suddenly he claims innocence the very first night he is free." "With respect, my king," Elara said, stepping forward despite the murmurs rippling through the assembled crowd. "If Cale wished to harm someone, why would he attack a guard positioned outside my door rather than simply leaving through it? He had every opportunity throughout the night to do exactly as you feared, and he did not." Draven's jaw tightened, clearly displeased at having his accusation questioned so directly in front of his own council. "Perhaps he is simply patient. Or perhaps," Elara said, "someone wanted it to look this way." A ripple of surprised murmurs spread through the hall at her suggestion. Draven leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing. "Explain yourself." "I have lived in this palace long enough to understand how quickly rumors spread and how easily blame finds the most convenient target," Elara said carefully. "Cale was released last night under conditions that many in this hall clearly resented. Is it truly so difficult to imagine that someone unhappy with that outcome might wish to see him blamed for something he did not do?" The senior council member standing beside Draven's throne spoke for the first time, her voice sharp and skeptical. "That is a serious accusation to make without evidence, young woman. As is accusing a man of an attack without any witnesses to confirm it." Ilara replied evenly. Draven studied her for a long moment, clearly weighing the political cost of pursuing punishment against a prisoner released under a law he had been forced to honor just hours earlier. Finally, he gestured toward one of his guards standing near the hall's entrance. "Bring the injured guard forward, if he has regained consciousness. Let him speak for himself." The guard, a broad-shouldered man named Owen, who Ilara recognized as one of the 6 stationed outside her door the previous night, was escorted into the hall looking pale and shaken, a bandage wrapped around the side of his head. He bowed stiffly before the throne, wincing at the movement. "Tell the court what happened," Draven instructed. Owen hesitated, his eyes flicking briefly toward Kale before returning to the king. "I was standing my post near the eastern corridor window, my king. I heard movement behind me, and before I could turn, something struck me across the head. I did not see my attacker." "You did not see him," Draven repeated slowly, "yet you assumed it was the prisoner." Owen's expression flickered with uncertainty. "I assumed, my king, because he was the only unfamiliar presence in the wing last night." "And yet," Ilara interjected, "if Kale had struck you, would he not have needed to pass directly by your position to reach the corridor beyond? The eastern wing has only one entrance from that direction, and I can confirm he never left my quarters throughout the entire night." Owen's brow furrowed slightly, clearly reconsidering the sequence of events. "That is true. The blow came from behind me, from the direction of the servants' staircase, not from the direction of the quarters." A heavy silence settled over the hall as the implications of that detail became clear. If the attack had come from the servants' staircase rather than from Ilara's quarters, it meant someone else entirely had been moving through the eastern wing that night, someone with reason to want the incident blamed on Kale. Draven's expression darkened, though whether from anger at the failed accusation or frustration at losing a convenient excuse to reverse the previous night's decision, Ilara could not be certain. "Investigate the servants' staircase," he ordered one of his advisors. "Question anyone who had access to that route last night." As the hall began to stir with renewed activity, guards dispatching to investigate the staircase and advisors murmuring among themselves about the sudden shift in circumstances, Ilara felt Kale's presence settle slightly beside her, some of the tension easing from his shoulders now that the immediate accusation had been at least partially dismantled. "You did not have to defend me," he said quietly, his voice low enough that only she could hear it amid the surrounding noise. "You did not attack anyone," Ilara replied simply. "I was only stating what was true." Kale studied her for a long moment, something complicated shifting behind his eyes. "Most people do not concern themselves with what is true when it comes to me. It is easier to simply believe the worst." "I am not most people," Ilara said. Before Kale could respond, Draven's voice cut through the hall once more, drawing everyone's attention back toward the throne. "This matter is not settled. Until the investigation is complete, the prisoner will remain under closer watch. Additional guards will be assigned, and any further incidents, regardless of who is responsible, will result in immediate consequences." Ilara understood the implication clearly enough, even if Draven had not stated it outright. The king was not interested in discovering the true culprit behind the attack on Owen. He was simply looking for the next opportunity to justify undoing what the law had forced him to allow. As the hall began to empty, nobles and advisors filing out in murmuring clusters, Grace appeared at Ilara's side, her expression tight with worry. "This is only the beginning," Grace whispered, glancing warily toward Kale, who remained standing a short distance away, his eyes tracking the departing guards with quiet, careful attention. "The king will not stop looking for reasons to reverse his decision. You have made yourself a target, and by extension, so has he." "I know," Ilara said quietly. "Then you understand what happens if the next incident cannot be explained away so easily," Grace said. "The court will not give you the benefit of doubt twice." Ilara glanced toward Kale, who had turned to look at her now, his expression unreadable but attentive, as though he too understood exactly what Grace's warning meant. Whatever had happened to Owen the previous night, whether orchestrated deliberately by someone within the palace or simply a misfortune of poor timing, one truth had become clear to Ilara in that hall. Someone within Ashwood Hollow wanted Kale blamed, wanted the previous night's ceremony undone, and was willing to manufacture the circumstances necessary to make that happen. As they walked together back toward the eastern wing, guards trailing a cautious distance behind them, Ilara found herself replaying the sequence of events from the throne hall, searching for any detail that might reveal who truly stood behind the attack. Kale walked silently beside her, his gaze fixed straight ahead, though she noticed him occasionally glancing toward the servants' staircase as they passed it. his expression sharpening with something that looked distinctly like recognition. "You know something," Elara said quietly, once they were far enough from the nearest guards to speak without being overheard. Cale's jaw tightened slightly. "I know that whoever struck your guard was skilled enough to do so silently, without waking anyone else in the wing. That is not the work of an ordinary servant." "Then who?" Elara asked. Cale did not answer immediately, his eyes fixed on some distant point down the corridor, calculating something Elara could not yet see. "I do not have proof," he said finally. "But I have learned, over the years, that those closest to power are often the most dangerous, precisely because no one thinks to suspect them." The words settled heavily between them as they continued down the corridor, the weight of unspoken suspicion following them like a shadow neither of them could yet fully name. Whatever had truly happened the previous night, Elara understood now that the danger surrounding her had only just begun, and that the true threat might not be the man walking silently beside her, but someone far closer to the throne than either of them had yet dared to consider. 3 days passed before the investigation into the attack on Owen produced any results, and when the findings finally reached Elara, they arrived not through official channels but through Grace, who slipped into her quarters late one evening with a look of quiet urgency on her face. "The servant who was questioned about the staircase has disappeared," Grace said without preamble, closing the door softly behind her. "No one has seen her since yesterday morning. Her name was Nora, and she worked directly under the senior council member, Lady Winifred." Elara straightened from where she had been sitting near the window. "Disappeared how?" "No one knows," Grace said. "Her quarters were found empty, her belongings gone. Some say she fled out of fear of being blamed for the attack. Others whisper that she was silenced before she could say anything that might implicate someone with more influence than a servant." Across the room, Cale, who had been standing near the doorway as he often did, listening without interrupting, finally spoke. "Lady Winifred," he said slowly, as though testing the name against something he already suspected. "You know her?" Elara asked. "I know of her," Cale said. "She sat beside the king in the throne hall 3 days ago. She has never once looked at me with anything resembling neutrality. Most in this palace fear me. She looks at me the way one looks at an obstacle rather than a threat." Elara considered this carefully. "You think she orchestrated the attack on Owen?" "I think," Cale said, "that someone wanted the king's decision reversed quickly, before the bond between us had any chance to take hold. A servant disappearing after being questioned suggests someone with far more power than a maid was involved in covering their tracks." Grace shifted uncomfortably. "This is dangerous territory to walk into. Lady Winifred has sat on the king's council for over a decade. Accusing her of orchestrating an attack, especially without solid proof, could bring consequences far worse than anything you have faced so far." "I am not planning to accuse anyone publicly," Elara said. "Not yet. But I intend to understand exactly what is happening within these walls before someone else decides my fate for me." That night, after Grace had left and the palace had settled into its usual quiet, Elara found herself unable to sleep, her mind turning over every detail of the past few days. Cale remained near the window as he always did, his silhouette outlined faintly against the moonlight filtering through the glass. She had noticed over the past 3 nights that he rarely slept at all, choosing instead to remain alert through the dark hours, as though decades of vigilance had trained his body to distrust rest entirely. "You should sleep," she said quietly, breaking the silence between them. "I have not needed much sleep in a long time," Cale replied, not turning from the window. Elara rose from her bed and crossed the room to stand beside him, close enough to see the tension still held in his jaw, the careful watchfulness that never seemed to fully leave his expression even in the quiet privacy of her quarters. "Why?" she asked. "What happened to you, before all of this?" For a long moment she thought he would not answer, exactly as he had refused to answer similar questions from Grace and the palace healers over the years. But something in his posture shifted slightly, and when he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than she had heard it before. "I was not always a rogue," he said. "I had a pack once, before the one everyone believes I destroyed. A different pack, smaller, in the eastern hills far from here. My bloodline was considered rare, valuable in ways I did not understand as a boy. When I was young, that pack was attacked by a group of hunters working for someone far more powerful than any of us realized. They killed most of my family. They kept me alive because of what I could offer them." Elara's breath caught slightly at the rawness in his voice, the careful control he maintained even now, recounting something clearly painful. "What did they want from you?" "They wanted my bloodline to continue," Cale said, his jaw tightening further. They kept me as something to be used, not as someone with a will of my own. For years, I was moved between different holdings, treated as property rather than a person. When I finally broke free, the violence that followed was not madness, it was survival. But the story that reached the kingdoms afterward painted me as a monster who slaughtered an entire pack without reason, and that story was easier for everyone to believe than the truth. Elara stood in silence for a long moment, absorbing the weight of what he had just shared, understanding now why the guards and healers who examined him over the years had always described strange, precise scarring rather than the wounds of battle. Why did no one investigate further? Why did the truth never reach the king? Because those who captured me originally had connections to power far beyond a single pack, Kale said quietly. Connections that extended into kingdoms like this one. It was simpler for everyone involved to let the story of a mindless monster stand, rather than examine what had truly happened and who had truly been responsible. The implications settled heavily between them, and Elara found herself recalling Draven's earlier reaction to her choosing Kale, the barely concealed fury beneath his composed exterior. The way he had reacted less like a king protecting his subjects, and more like someone protecting a secret he did not want uncovered. "Do you think King Draven knows the truth?" she asked carefully. Kale turned to look at her fully for the first time since the conversation began, something sharp and calculating behind his eyes. "I think," he said slowly, "that a king who insists so forcefully on keeping a story alive, even when the man at the center of it has done nothing to confirm it in 3 years of captivity, is a king who has more reason to fear the truth than to fear the monster he has created." Elara felt a chill settle over her that had nothing to do with the cool night air drifting through the window. If Kale's suspicions were correct, then the danger surrounding them was far greater than a jealous council member or a manufactured accusation. It suggested that King Draven himself had reason to keep Kale silenced, chained, and dismissed as a mindless threat, rather than allow the truth of his bloodline and his past to surface. "If that is true," she said quietly, "then releasing you last night was not simply a matter of honoring an old law. It was a risk he could not afford to take, and one he will do everything in his power to correct." Kale's expression remained steady, though something resolute settled into his posture, a quiet determination that had not been there during his years of silent captivity. "Then we will need to be careful," he said. "More careful than we have been so far." "We," Elara repeated softly, something in the word settling comfortably despite the danger surrounding it. Kale glanced at her, and for the first time since the chains had come off, something close to a genuine, unguarded expression crossed his features, quiet and brief, but unmistakably real. "You chose to stand beside me in that courtyard when every instinct should have told you to walk toward safety instead. Whatever comes next, I do not intend to let that choice cost you your life." Elara held his gaze, feeling something shift quietly between them. A fragile but growing trust neither of them had expected to find in circumstances built from fear and suspicion. "Then we face whatever comes together," she said, starting with finding out exactly what Lady Winifred knows, and why a servant vanished the moment she was questioned about it. Kale nodded slowly, and outside the window, the palace remained quiet under the cover of night, unaware that within its walls, 2 people the kingdom had underestimated in very different ways were beginning to piece together a truth far more dangerous than anyone had prepared for. The following morning, as sunlight filtered pale and cold through the eastern windows, Elara resolved to seek out Lady Winifred directly, understanding that whatever answers she needed would not come from waiting quietly for danger to find her first. Kale, watching her prepare to leave the quarters, said little, though the careful way he studied the corridor beyond the door before allowing her to step through it told her clearly enough that he intended to remain close, whether the guards outside approved of it or not. Whatever truth waited to be uncovered within the palace walls, both of them understood now that the choosing had set into motion something far larger than either of them had anticipated, and that the quiet, careful trust building between them might soon become the only thing standing between survival and the fate the kingdom had already decided for a man it refused to see as anything more than a monster. Lady Winifred's chambers occupied the western tower, a section of the palace reserved for the king's most trusted advisors, and Elara found herself hesitating outside the heavy oak door longer than she intended, aware that whatever she said in the next few minutes could either uncover the truth or draw dangerous attention toward herself and Kale both. When she finally knocked, the door opened to reveal Lady Winifred herself, a tall woman with sharp features and silver-streaked hair pulled back into a severe knot, her expression carefully composed into polite neutrality that did not quite reach her eyes. "Elara," Lady Winifred said, her tone even, "I did not expect a visit from you. Please, come in. The chamber inside was elegant, but sparse, decorated with maps of Ashwood Hollow's northern territories and shelves of carefully organized scrolls. Lady Winifred gestured toward a chair near the window, seating herself opposite with the composed patience of someone accustomed to controlling every conversation she entered. I imagine you are here about the servant, Lady Winifred said before Alara could speak. Nora's disappearance has caused quite a stir among the staff. I am, Alara admitted, deciding directness would serve her better than careful maneuvering with someone clearly skilled at both. She worked for you. I hoped you might know something about where she went, or why. Lady Winifred's expression remained smooth, though something flickered briefly behind her eyes. I wish I could offer more clarity. Nora served me faithfully for 2 years. Her sudden disappearance troubled me as much as it troubled the guards investigating the attack on Owen. Do you believe her disappearance is connected to that attack? Alara asked carefully. I believe, Lady Winifred said, folding her hands neatly in her lap, that fear makes people do foolish things. Perhaps she panicked at the thought of being blamed for something she witnessed but did not commit. Perhaps she fled out of simple cowardice. Or perhaps, Alara said, watching Lady Winifred's expression closely, she knew something dangerous enough that someone decided her silence was worth more than her continued presence in this palace. The silence that followed stretched long enough to feel deliberate, and Alara noticed Lady Winifred's fingers tighten slightly against the arm of her chair, before smoothing back into practiced composure. That is a serious accusation to imply, even without naming names directly. I am not accusing you of anything, my lady, Alara said evenly. I am simply trying to understand why a servant would vanish so completely, so quickly, immediately after being questioned about an attack that conveniently would have justified reversing the king's decision regarding my choosing. Lady Winifred studied her for a long moment, something calculating shifting behind her composed exterior. You are more perceptive than the court gives you credit for, she said finally. Very well. I will offer you honesty, though you may not find it comforting. I did not orchestrate the attack on Owen, nor did I arrange Nora's disappearance. But I will admit, freely, that I believe your choice at the choosing was a grave mistake, and I have made no secret of my hope that the king finds a lawful reason to correct it. What threat does Chaol pose to you specifically? Lady Winifred's expression hardened slightly. Not to me specifically. To the stability of this kingdom. You do not understand the history behind that man's bloodline, child. Ashwood Hollow's current ruling line was not always the only claim to this throne. There was another bloodline, generations ago, one considered more rightful by ancient law, though it was quietly pushed aside through circumstances that predate even King Draven's own father. Alara felt her pulse quicken. Are you suggesting Chaol's bloodline is connected to that lost claim? I am suggesting nothing so specific, Lady Winifred said carefully, though her tone suggested she knew far more than she intended to reveal outright. I am simply telling you that certain bloodlines carry old, inconvenient histories, and that those histories become dangerous the moment they resurface, in ways that threaten the current balance of power. If you wish to understand why so many within this palace fear that man beyond the stories of violence attached to his name, you might consider asking yourself why King Draven has spent 3 years insisting he remains silenced rather than simply executed outright, if he truly believed him nothing more than a mindless threat. The words settled heavily in the quiet chamber, confirming suspicions that Chaol himself had voiced only the night before. Alara studied Lady Winifred carefully, searching for any further hint of the truth hidden beneath her careful, measured words. Thank you for your honesty, my lady, she said finally. Even if it was not entirely the honesty I expected. Be careful, child, Lady Winifred said, as Alara rose to leave. Whatever you believe you are protecting by standing beside that man, understand that some truths, once uncovered, cannot be quietly buried again. And those who benefit from them staying buried will not hesitate to protect their interests, regardless of who stands in their way. Alara left the Western Tower with far more questions than answers, her mind racing through the implications of what Lady Winifred had revealed. By the time she returned to the Eastern Wing, Chaol was waiting near the window exactly as she had left him, his expression sharpening with concern the moment he saw her face. What did you learn? He asked. Alara relayed the conversation carefully, watching Chaol's expression shift through a range of emotions he rarely allowed himself to display, surprise giving way to something more guarded and thoughtful. A lost bloodline, he repeated quietly, almost to himself. That would explain much that I never understood about my own capture. What do you mean? Alara asked. The hunters who took me as a child, Chaol said slowly, clearly piecing together fragments of memory he had long avoided examining too closely, spoke sometimes among themselves, Careless words I was too young to fully understand at the time. They spoke of value beyond simple ransom, of bloodline and rightful claim, phrases I dismissed as nonsense from men who saw me as nothing more than property to be traded. If what Lady Winifred suggests is true, then perhaps those words carried more weight than I ever realized. Before either of them could examine the implications further, a sharp commotion erupted somewhere near the courtyard below. Shouts and the clatter of hurried footsteps carrying up through the open window. Elara moved quickly to look outside, her stomach tightening at the sight of guards rushing toward the eastern wing entrance, weapons drawn. "Something is wrong," she said. Cale was already moving toward the door, his posture shifting into the same careful, alert readiness she had noticed the very first night the chains came off. "Stay behind me," he said, his voice low and controlled. The door burst open before either of them could reach it, revealing Owen, the guard from the earlier attack, his face pale and urgent. "There is an intruder in the palace," he said quickly, armed, moving toward the eastern wing. "The king has ordered every available guard to secure this section immediately." "An intruder," Elara repeated. "Do we know who?" Owen shook his head. "Not yet, but whoever it is moved quickly enough to avoid the outer patrols entirely. This was planned, and planned well." Cale's eyes narrowed slightly, something calculating passing behind them. "Where exactly was the intruder last seen?" "Near the servants' staircase," Owen said. "The same route used the night I was attacked." The connection settled heavily between Elara and Cale, both of them recognizing immediately that whatever was unfolding now was almost certainly tied to the same forces responsible for the earlier incident and Nora's mysterious disappearance. If someone had gone to such lengths to manufacture false evidence against Cale once already, an armed intruder moving through the same corridor now suggested an escalation far more dangerous than anything they had faced so far. "Elara should remain in the quarters, guarded," Cale said firmly, turning toward Owen. "And you?" Owen asked, his tone still carrying traces of the earlier suspicion, though tempered now by something closer to grudging respect after the throne hall's revelations. "I intend to find out exactly who is moving through this palace, and why," Cale said, "before anyone else decides to blame me for whatever happens next." Elara stepped forward quickly, refusing to be left behind despite the obvious danger. If this intruder is connected to whoever silenced Nora, then whoever they are, they likely intend to finish what the earlier incident failed to accomplish. "I am not staying here while you walk into that alone." Cale turned to look at her, clearly torn between the instinct to protect her and the recognition that she had proven, repeatedly, that she was not someone easily persuaded to stand aside. Finally, he gave a short, reluctant nod. "Then stay close," he said, "and trust nothing you cannot see with your own eyes." Together, with Owen and 2 additional guards following cautiously behind, they moved toward the servants' staircase, the corridor ahead falling into an uneasy, tense silence broken only by the distant echo of hurried footsteps somewhere deeper within the palace's shadowed passages. Whatever waited for them in the darkness ahead, both Elara and Cale understood now that the danger surrounding them had shifted from suspicion and rumor into something far more immediate and real, a threat close enough to reach them within the very walls meant to keep them safe. The servants' staircase spiraled down into shadow. The torches along its walls burned low and flickering, casting uneven light across the worn stone steps. Elara kept close behind Cale as they descended, her heart beat loud in her own ears, while Owen and the 2 guards followed a few steps back, weapons drawn and ready. Halfway down, Cale suddenly raised a hand, signaling everyone to stop. He tilted his head slightly, listening to something none of the others could yet detect. "Someone is below us," he said quietly. "Waiting, not moving." "How can you tell?" Owen whispered. "Years of listening for exactly this," Cale answered simply, and no one questioned him further. They continued more cautiously, and as they reached the bottom of the staircase, a narrow corridor opened before them, leading toward a storage chamber rarely used by the palace staff. A single figure stood near the chamber's entrance, cloaked and hooded, motionless in a way that suggested deliberate waiting rather than surprise at their approach. "Show yourself," Owen commanded, his voice carrying more confidence than his earlier injury might have suggested he still possessed. The figure remained still for a long moment before slowly lowering the hood, revealing a face Elara recognized instantly. It was Nora, the missing servant, though she looked nothing like the composed young woman Elara vaguely remembered seeing occasionally in Lady Winifred's company. Her eyes were hollow with exhaustion, her hands trembling visibly even in the dim torchlight. "Nora," Elara said, stepping forward carefully. "Everyone believed you had disappeared." "I did disappear," Nora said, her voice shaking. Because I was told that if I did not, I would not survive to see another sunrise. Who told you that? Kale asked, his voice calm despite the tension radiating from everyone present. Nora hesitated, her eyes darting nervously toward the shadows behind her, as though fearing someone might still be listening. I cannot say his name here, it is not safe, but I can tell you that the attack on Owen was arranged deliberately, meant to look like you're doing, she said, glancing toward Kale. I was paid to leave a door unlocked that night, nothing more. I did not know what would happen afterward. When I realized what had been done, and that questions were being asked, I was warned to disappear quietly, or face consequences far worse than exile. Why come back now? Ilara asked gently, recognizing the fear still gripping the young woman. Because tonight, another attack is planned, Nora said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Not against a guard this time, against you. Her eyes fixed on Ilara with something like desperate urgency. I could not stay silent while that happened, not after everything I have already been part of. Kale's expression sharpened immediately, his posture shifting into something more alert and protective. Who is behind this? He demanded, his voice low but firm. Nora swallowed hard before answering. Men hired from beyond the northern border, men connected to whoever originally captured you years ago. I heard them speaking through the storage chamber wall 2 nights past, discussing payment for silencing you once and for all, and making certain the blame fell entirely on him, she said, gesturing toward Kale. The implications settled heavily over the small group gathered in the dim corridor. If Nora's information was accurate, then the earlier attack on Owen had merely been a preliminary attempt to discredit Kale, before this larger plan against Ilara's life could unfold, and whoever orchestrated it clearly intended to eliminate both the threat Kale represented and the growing bond that had formed since the choosing. Where are they now? Kale asked. I do not know exactly, Nora admitted, but they mentioned moving through the eastern wing tonight, timing their approach for when the guard rotation changes and attention is briefly divided. Owen's expression tightened with realization. The rotation changes within the hour. Kale turned immediately toward Ilara, urgency replacing his usual measured calm. We need to return to the eastern wing now, and warn the guards stationed there before the rotation begins. As they hurried back up the staircase, Nora following cautiously behind under Owen's watchful escort, Ilara found herself grappling with the full weight of what they had just learned. The danger surrounding them was no longer simply political maneuvering or manufactured suspicion. It was a direct, planned attempt on her life, orchestrated by forces connected to whatever secret Kale's bloodline represented, forces powerful enough to reach into the palace itself and manipulate frightened servants into unwitting compliance. They reached the eastern wing just as the guard rotation was beginning, torches being relit along the corridor while the outgoing watch prepared to hand duties over to the incoming shift. Kale moved quickly to alert the guards nearest Ilara's quarters, relaying Nora's warning with clipped, urgent precision that left no room for doubt or hesitation. Double the watch, Owen instructed the guards immediately. No one enters or exits this wing without explicit authorization. Despite the added precautions, an uneasy tension settled over the corridor as everyone waited, watching every shadow with heightened suspicion. Ilara stood near her quarters entrance, Kale positioned protectively close beside her, both of them scanning the dimly lit hallway for any sign of the threat Nora had warned them about. It was nearly a quarter-hour later, just as the last of the rotation guards took their positions, when a sudden commotion erupted from the far end of the corridor, shouts and the clash of steel echoing sharply through the stone hallway. Kale reacted instantly, positioning himself directly between Ilara and the source of the disturbance. Every muscle in his body coiled and ready. "Stay behind me," he said, his voice low and steady despite the chaos unfolding rapidly around them. 2 figures emerged from the shadows near the corridor's far end, moving with the practiced efficiency of trained fighters rather than desperate intruders. The guards nearest them engaged immediately, but the attackers moved with brutal precision, clearly having anticipated resistance and prepared accordingly. Kale's eyes narrowed as he assessed the unfolding confrontation, and Ilara watched, both frightened and strangely fascinated, as the tension coiled through his frame seemed to sharpen into something focused rather than wild. When the first attacker broke through the guards' defense and lunged toward their position, Kale moved with a speed and precision that left no doubt about the truth behind the strength the kingdom had always feared. He intercepted the attacker cleanly, disarming him within moments through controlled, deliberate movements rather than the mindless violence everyone had always assumed defined him. The second attacker hesitated at the sight, clearly recalculating the situation, before attempting to retreat back toward the shadows he had emerged from. "Do not let him escape," Kale called sharply to the remaining guards, who quickly moved to cut off the retreat. Within moments, both attackers had been subdued, restrained by the guards while Kale stood protectively beside Alara, his breathing steady despite the brief but intense confrontation. The disarmed attacker, still pinned by two guards, glared up at Kale with something between fear and grudging respect. "You fought without losing control," Owen said, arriving breathlessly from his position near the corridor's entrance, clear astonishment coloring his voice as he took in the scene before him. "I have always had control," Kale said quietly, his eyes still scanning the corridor for any additional threats. "What I have never had is a reason to use it for something other than survival." Alara studied him carefully in the aftermath of the confrontation, recognizing the significance of what had just happened. The kingdom had spent 3 years believing Kale incapable of restraint, a mindless danger requiring chains and constant surveillance to manage. Yet in the moment it mattered most, he had fought with precise, controlled purpose, protecting rather than destroying, exactly as she had always suspected he was capable of doing. As the guards moved to secure the captured attackers for questioning, Nora, still trembling from her earlier confession, approached Alara cautiously. "I am sorry," she said quietly, "for my part in what happened to your guard, and for waiting so long to come forward about tonight's plan. You came forward when it mattered most," Alara said gently. "That matters more than the mistake that came before it." As the immediate danger settled and the corridor slowly returned to a semblance of order, Alara turned to look at Kale, still standing close beside her, his expression finally allowing a flicker of relief now that the confrontation had passed without harm coming to her. Whatever forces were working against them, whoever truly stood behind the coordinated attempts to discredit and now directly harm her, tonight's events had proven something undeniable to everyone who had witnessed it. The monster the kingdom feared was not the danger they needed to guard against. The true threat lay hidden somewhere deeper within the palace's own walls, among those with far more power and far more to lose than a man who had spent 3 years in chains for a crime that increasingly appeared to belong to someone else entirely. The interrogation of the 2 captured attackers began at dawn, conducted in a fortified chamber deep within the palace's lower levels, far from the ears of curious servants or wandering nobles. King Draven himself presided over the questioning, his expression tight with barely contained fury at the audacity of an attack occurring within his own walls, though Alara noticed something else beneath his anger, a carefully guarded wariness that suggested he understood more about the situation than he wished to reveal. The first attacker, a broad, scarred man who refused to give his name, remained silent through most of the questioning, offering nothing beyond defiant glares directed mostly at Kale, who stood near the chamber's entrance observing the proceedings with quiet, controlled attention. It was the second attacker, younger and visibly more shaken by the previous night's failure, who finally broke under the weight of Draven's mounting impatience. "We were hired," the younger man admitted, his voice trembling. "Paid well, told only that the target was a woman recently bonded to a dangerous rogue, and that eliminating her would create enough chaos to justify recapturing him permanently." "Who hired you?" Draven demanded. The young man hesitated, clearly weighing the danger of speaking against the danger of remaining silent. "A man who never gave his name, my king. He met us near the northern border, offered payment through an intermediary, but I recognized his voice from years ago, when I served briefly under a hunting party that once dealt in rare bloodlines, before disbanding when their operation was discovered and shut down." Kale's posture stiffened noticeably at the mention of the hunting party, and Alara, watching him closely, saw something flicker across his expression that looked almost like recognition mixed with old, deeply buried pain. "Rare bloodlines," Draven repeated, his tone carefully controlled, though Alara noticed his hands tighten slightly against the arms of his chair. "Yes, my king," the young man continued, clearly relieved to have information valuable enough to potentially spare him harsher punishment. "The man who hired us spoke of ensuring a particular bloodline never resurfaced to challenge certain claims that had been settled generations ago. I did not understand the full meaning at the time, only that the payment was generous enough not to ask further questions." The chamber fell into heavy silence following this revelation, and Alara watched King Draven's expression carefully, searching for any sign of the truth Lady Winifred had hinted at during their earlier conversation. Whatever calculations passed behind the king's eyes in that moment, he revealed nothing further, simply ordering the guards to remove both prisoners for continued questioning, while he considered the implications privately. Once the chamber had cleared of everyone except Alara, Kale, and the king himself, Draven finally turned to face them directly, his expression unreadable. "You wish to ask me something?" he said, addressing Alara. I can see it clearly enough. Ask it. Alara hesitated only briefly before deciding directness remained her strongest approach. Lady Winifred suggested that Kael's bloodline may be connected to a claim on this throne considered more rightful than your own family's current position, generations ago. Is that true? Draven's expression tightened, though he did not immediately deny the accusation, which told Alara more than any direct answer could have. History is complicated, he said finally, his voice carrying a weariness that had not been present in his earlier fury. Generations ago, before my grandfather secured Ashwood Hollow's throne, there existed an older bloodline, with a stronger claim by ancient law. A bloodline nearly extinguished through circumstances my family has never openly discussed. And Kael belongs to that bloodline, Alara said quietly, though it was not truly a question. I did not know for certain until recently, Draven admitted, his gaze shifting toward Kael with something complicated behind it, neither fully hostile nor fully accepting. When you were first captured 3 years ago, reports of your scarring and the peculiar interest certain hunting parties showed in your survival reached my advisors. I suspected then what your presence might mean, but I chose silence rather than confirmation, believing it safer for everyone involved, myself included, if the truth remained buried alongside the story already accepted by the kingdom. Kael's jaw tightened, something raw and long suppressed finally surfacing in his expression. You knew, he said, his voice low and controlled despite the clear anger beneath it. You knew the truth behind my capture, behind everything that was done to me, and you chose to let the kingdom believe I was simply a mindless monster, rather than risk the truth threatening your family's claim. I did what I believed necessary to protect the stability of this kingdom, Draven said, though his voice lacked its usual authority now, carrying instead something closer to reluctant acknowledgement. A bloodline with a stronger claim resurfacing after generations would have thrown Ashwood Hollow into chaos, into conflict between competing loyalties that could have cost far more lives than the silence I chose to maintain. And what of my life? Kael demanded, stepping forward despite the guards still stationed near the chamber's entrance. What of the years I spent chained, muzzled, treated as a warning rather than a person, simply because acknowledging the truth was inconvenient for you? Draven met his gaze steadily, though something like genuine regret flickered briefly across his features. I cannot undo what was done to you, he said quietly. But I can tell you now, plainly, that whoever hired those attackers last night clearly understands the same truth I have long suspected, and they are willing to kill to ensure it never surfaces publicly. That makes both of you targets, regardless of anything I choose to acknowledge or deny going forward. Alara considered this carefully, recognizing the shift in dynamics unfolding before her. Whatever animosity existed between Draven and Kael, whatever secrets the king had chosen to protect at Kael's expense, the immediate danger they now faced came from an external force with far more to lose from the truth surfacing than Draven himself. If Kael's bloodline threatens old claims to power, Alara said slowly, working through the implications aloud, then whoever hired those attackers likely benefits directly from the current arrangement remaining unchanged. That suggests someone with significant influence, someone who would lose considerably if the truth of Kael's identity became widely known. Draven's expression sharpened with the same calculation Alara recognized from their earlier confrontations. You are suggesting the threat comes from within my own court. I am suggesting, Alara said carefully, that Lady Winifred's warnings, combined with a servant paid to enable an attack, followed by hired assassins referencing an old hunting party connected to Kael's original capture, points towards someone with resources and motivation, far beyond simple political rivalry. The king remained silent for a long moment, clearly turning the possibilities over in his mind with the same careful calculation that had defined his rule for over 2 decades. Finally he spoke, his voice measured but firm. I will order a full investigation into every noble family with historical ties to the original bloodline dispute. Quietly, without alerting whoever may be responsible that we suspect involvement closer to the throne than previously considered. And what of Kael? Alara asked. Does this change anything regarding his status, given what you now openly acknowledge? Draven's gaze shifted toward Kael, something complicated and unresolved passing between the two men who had, until this conversation, existed only as captor and prisoner. The law of the choosing remains binding, Draven said finally. Whatever history exists between his bloodline and mine, that law does not change based on inconvenient truths. He remains free, under your protection as your chosen mate, and I will ensure additional resources are dedicated toward keeping both of you safe while this investigation proceeds. It was not full acceptance, nor was it complete acknowledgement of the wrong done to Cale over the past 3 years. But it was more than either of them had expected from a king who had spent so long protecting his own family's claim through careful, deliberate silence. As they left the chamber together, guards trailing at a respectful distance now rather than the suspicious proximity they had maintained since the choosing, Elara glanced toward Cale, noting the storm of emotion still visible beneath his carefully controlled exterior. "This changes things," she said quietly. "It confirms what I suspected but never allowed myself to fully believe," Cale replied, his voice still tight with barely restrained emotion, "that the story told about me was never truly about my own actions. It was always about protecting someone else's claim to power, regardless of what it cost me." "Then we uncover the rest of the truth together," Elara said firmly. "Whoever is responsible for hiring those attackers, whoever benefits most from your silence, we will find them before they have another opportunity to finish what they started." Cale studied her for a long moment, something steady and resolute settling into his expression, despite the weight of everything just revealed. "Together," he repeated quietly, the word carrying far more significance now than it had during their earlier, more cautious exchanges. Whatever awaited them as the investigation into Ashwood Hollow's oldest secrets began to unfold, both of them understood now that the danger surrounding them extended far beyond simple rumor or political maneuvering. Somewhere within the palace's own walls, someone with considerable power was prepared to kill rather than allow the truth of Cale's bloodline to resurface, and uncovering their identity had become as urgent as surviving whatever they attempted next. The investigation ordered by King Draven moved carefully over the following days, conducted quietly enough to avoid alerting whoever within the palace might be responsible for orchestrating the attacks. Elara found herself drawn deeper into the effort, working alongside Grace to review old records concerning the original bloodline dispute, while Cale spent hours with Owen, examining the captured attackers' possessions for any additional clues about who had hired them. It was during one such evening, as Elara sorted through faded genealogical scrolls in the palace archives, that Grace made a discovery that sent a chill through the quiet, dusty room. "Elara," she said, her voice tight with alarm as she studied a particular document more closely. "This record of the original bloodline dispute mentions a name I recognize." Elara moved quickly to look over Grace's shoulder at the aged parchment. Its ink faded but still legible. The document outlined the circumstances surrounding the original claim dispute generations earlier, detailing how the rightful heir's family had been quietly displaced through what the record vaguely described as unfortunate circumstances. At the bottom of the page, listed among the advisors who had orchestrated the transition of power, was a family name that Elara recognized instantly. "Winifred," she read aloud, her stomach tightening. "This says an ancestor of Lady Winifred's family played a direct role in displacing the original bloodline." Grace nodded grimly. If her family benefited directly from that original arrangement, and if Cale's presence threatens to expose the truth of that history, then she has far more motivation than simple political rivalry to want him silenced permanently. Elara felt the pieces settling into place with unsettling clarity. Lady Winifred's carefully composed warnings during their earlier conversation, her barely concealed hope that Draven would find a lawful reason to reverse the choosing, her family's historical connection to the original displacement of Cale's bloodline, all of it pointed toward a motive far more personal and dangerous than Elara had initially considered. "We need to tell Cale," Elara said, already moving toward the archives exit. She found him in the training yard behind the eastern wing, where he had taken to practicing with a sword under Owen's watchful supervision, both men having developed an uneasy but genuine respect for one another since the confrontation in the corridor days earlier. When Elara relayed what she and Grace had discovered, Cale's expression darkened considerably. "Lady Winifred," he said slowly, testing the implications of the name against everything he had already suspected. "It would explain why she seemed to know so much about the history of the bloodline dispute during your conversation with her, far more than someone with only passing knowledge of ancient records would typically possess. We still lack direct proof connecting her to the hired attackers," Owen pointed out cautiously. "A family connection to old history is not the same as evidence of current involvement. Then we need to find that proof," Elara said firmly, "before she has another opportunity to arrange something worse than what has already been attempted." That evening, as the palace settled into its familiar quiet rhythms, Elara found herself unable to shake the growing unease that had settled over her since the archive discovery. Cale remained close throughout the evening, his protective instincts sharpened considerably since the attack in the corridor, and Elara noticed him glancing toward the window periodically, as though anticipating another threat before it fully materialized. It was well past midnight when the threat finally arrived, though not in the form either of them expected. A soft knock at the door drew Cale's immediate attention, and when he opened it cautiously, he found not an armed intruder but Nora, the servant who had helped warn them of the previous attack, her face pale with fresh urgency. "Lady Winifred knows that her family's connection has been discovered," Nora whispered, glancing anxiously down the corridor behind her. "She sent for me an hour ago, questioning me about who I had spoken to since my return. I fear she suspects I revealed more than I intended." "What did you tell her?" Ilara asked, moving quickly to the doorway. "Nothing directly," Nora said. "But she is not foolish. She will assume the worst, and I believe she intends to act tonight, before the investigation can gather enough proof to move against her openly." Cale's expression hardened with immediate resolve. "Where is she now?" "I do not know for certain," Nora admitted, "but I overheard mention of the Northern Gate, where additional hired men have reportedly been positioned for several days, waiting for exactly this kind of urgency." Ilara felt her pulse quicken with the recognition that whatever confrontation awaited them now would likely be far more direct and dangerous than the previous attempts. "We need to warn the king immediately." Cale was already moving toward the door, though he paused briefly to look back at Ilara with something fierce and protective in his expression. "You will remain here, guarded, while I—" "No," Ilara interrupted firmly, meeting his gaze without hesitation. "I did not choose you in that courtyard to hide safely away every time danger approaches. Whatever happens tonight, we face it together, exactly as we agreed." Cale studied her for a long moment, clearly torn between the instinct to protect her at all costs and the recognition that she had proven, repeatedly, her refusal to be shielded from the very danger she had willingly stepped into by choosing him. Finally, he gave a short, reluctant nod. "Then stay close, and trust nothing beyond what your own eyes confirm." Together, with Owen quickly summoned and additional guards alerted, they made their way toward the northern gate under cover of darkness, the palace's usual nighttime quiet, replaced now by the tense alertness of guards moving swiftly through corridors, rarely used at such an hour. As they approached the gate, Ilara could see figures moving in the shadows beyond the torchlight, more numerous than the two attackers from the previous confrontation, suggesting Lady Winifred had prepared far more thoroughly for this attempt. "Stay back," Cale instructed the group quietly, his eyes scanning the shadows with the same sharp, calculating focus that had proven so effective in their previous confrontation. "There are more of them this time. We need to draw them into the open before they can coordinate an ambush." Before further strategy could be discussed, movement erupted from the shadows near the gate, multiple armed figures emerging with the same practiced efficiency the earlier attackers had demonstrated. Cale positioned himself immediately between Ilara and the approaching threat, while Owen and the accompanying guards moved to engage the flanking figures attempting to circle around them. The confrontation that followed unfolded with brutal speed, torchlight flickering wildly across the chaos of clashing steel and urgent shouts. Ilara watched, heart pounding, as Cale moved through the fight with the same controlled precision he had shown days earlier, disarming attackers, rather than resorting to the mindless destruction everyone had always feared from him. Yet even his considerable skill began to strain against the sheer number of opponents Lady Winifred had clearly prepared, and Ilara felt genuine fear settle into her chest as she watched him take a glancing blow to the shoulder from an attacker who had slipped past his guard. It was in that moment of vulnerability, as Cale staggered slightly from the impact, that Ilara understood with sudden clarity the depth of what she had risked by refusing to remain safely hidden away. If the fight turned against them now, both of their lives hung in the balance, and no law or ceremony would matter if neither of them survived the night to see justice done. "Cale," she called out, her voice sharp with warning, as another attacker moved to exploit his momentary weakness. He recovered instantly, spinning to intercept the new threat with renewed focus, though Ilara could see the strain now visible in his expression, the toll of fighting against numbers far greater than the previous confrontation had presented. Just as the situation seemed poised to tip dangerously against them, the sound of additional footsteps thundered from behind, and King Draven himself arrived at the head of a substantial contingent of palace guards, having been alerted by a messenger Owen had dispatched the moment they departed the eastern wing. The arrival of reinforcements shifted the balance of the confrontation decisively, and within minutes, the remaining attackers found themselves overwhelmed and quickly subdued. As the chaos finally settled, guards moving to secure the captured fighters while others tended to the wounded, Ilara rushed to Cale's side, examining the wound at his shoulder with trembling hands. "I am fine," he assured her, though his breathing remained heavy from the exertion of the fight. "It is not deep." King Draven approached them directly, his expression grim as he surveyed the aftermath of the confrontation. Lady Winifred has fled the palace grounds, he said without preamble. Guards discovered her chambers empty, moments after this attack began, along with evidence suggesting she anticipated failure and prepared an escape route in advance. Then she remains a threat, Alara said, still tending carefully to Cale's shoulder. One I intend to pursue relentlessly, Draven replied, his voice carrying a resolve that had been notably absent during their earlier, more evasive conversations. Whatever role my family's history played in the truth she sought to bury, I will not allow her to threaten the stability of this kingdom, or the lives of those under my protection, simply to preserve secrets that should have been resolved generations ago. As the guards moved to secure the northern gate and begin the process of tracking Lady Winifred's escape, Alara felt Cale's hand rest gently against her own, a small gesture of reassurance amid the lingering chaos of the confrontation's aftermath. "We survived," he said quietly, his voice still rough from exertion, but steady enough to carry genuine relief. "We did," Alara agreed, though she understood clearly enough that whatever came next, with Lady Winifred still at large, and the full truth of Cale's bloodline still not entirely resolved, the danger surrounding them had not yet reached its conclusion. If anything, tonight's confrontation had confirmed that the stakes involved were far higher than either of them had initially understood, reaching into the very foundations of Ashwood Hollow's claim to power. The search for Lady Winifred continued for nearly a week following the confrontation at the northern gate, guards dispatched across every territory under Ashwood Hollow's influence, while King Draven's advisors worked to piece together the full extent of her involvement in both the original attacks and the ancient bloodline dispute that had motivated them. Alara spent much of that week alongside Cale, both of them recovering slowly from the physical and emotional toll of the confrontation, while continuing to assist wherever the investigation required. It was during this period that an unexpected visitor arrived at the palace gates, an elderly woman named Hannah, who identified herself as a former healer who had once served the Eastern Hill Pack that Cale had described as his original home before its destruction. Word of her arrival reached Alara and Cale quickly, and they met with her in a quiet chamber away from the palace's more public gathering spaces. Hannah studied Cale carefully upon their introduction, her aged eyes tracing the features of his face with something between recognition and quiet sorrow. "You have your mother's eyes," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly with the weight of memories clearly long buried. "I served as healer to your pack when you were a boy, before the attack that took everything from you." Cale's expression shifted through a complicated range of emotions, surprise giving way to something rawer and more vulnerable than Alara had seen from him since their earliest conversations. "You knew my family," he said quietly. "I knew them well," Hannah confirmed. "Your mother was the last direct descendant of the original bloodline displaced generations ago from Ashwood Hollow's throne. I have carried this knowledge quietly for years, fearing what might happen if it ever became widely known. But when I heard whispers reaching even the distant villages of a rogue chosen at the choosing, a man matching your description, I knew I could no longer remain silent." "Why now?" Alara asked gently. "Why come forward after so many years of silence?" Hannah's expression tightened with old grief. "Because I have also heard whispers of Lady Winifred's flight from the palace, and I understand better than most the lengths her family has historically gone to in order to protect their position. If she remains free, she remains dangerous, and the full truth needs to be established clearly enough that no future attempt to silence it can succeed." Over the following hour, Hannah shared details of Cale's early childhood that he himself had only fragmentary memories of, confirming the ancient claim his bloodline held to Ashwood Hollow's throne, a claim considered more rightful by the kingdom's oldest laws than the line Draven's family currently occupied. She spoke of his mother's quiet dignity, despite living under constant threat, of his father's efforts to keep their true heritage hidden from those who might exploit it, and finally, with visible pain, of the night hunters connected to Lady Winifred's ancestors had attacked their settlement, killing most of the pack, and taking the young Cale captive for reasons that Hannah herself had only partially understood until years later. By the time Hannah finished her account, Alara found herself watching Cale carefully, recognizing the profound weight of finally understanding the full truth behind a childhood he had spent years trying not to remember too clearly. "This changes everything," she said quietly, once Hannah had been shown to comfortable quarters to rest from her long journey. "It confirms what has already been suspected," Cale replied, though his voice carried a rawness that suggested the confirmation itself, regardless of prior suspicion, still struck deeply. "But confirmation from someone who knew my family directly, someone willing to testify to it openly, changes the political weight of what we now know." News of Hannah's arrival and testimony spread quickly through the palace, and within days, King Draven called for a formal gathering of his council and the kingdom's most influential noble families, a rare and significant event typically reserved only for matters of the gravest importance. Ilara and Kale stood together in the grand hall as the assembly gathered, aware that whatever unfolded in the coming hours would likely determine the future course of Ashwood Hollow far beyond their own personal circumstances. Draven rose to address the assembled nobles with a gravity that silenced the murmuring crowd almost instantly. Generations ago, he began, this kingdom's claim to the throne was secured through circumstances that displaced an older, more rightful bloodline. My family has maintained silence regarding this history, believing it necessary for stability. That silence, I now recognize, allowed grave injustice to continue unchecked, culminating in the near destruction of that bloodline's last remaining descendants, and the years of captivity endured by the man many of you have known only as a dangerous rogue. Murmurs rippled through the hall as Draven's words settled over the gathered nobles, many of them clearly stunned by the king's unprecedented acknowledgement of a history most had believed safely buried. Draven gestured toward Hannah, who stood quietly near the hall's entrance, and then toward Kale, who remained composed despite the weight of every eye in the chamber now fixed upon him. This woman has testified, in detail, to the identity and heritage of the man standing before you, Draven continued. Her account, combined with evidence uncovered during the recent investigation into attacks against both him and the woman who chose him at the choosing, confirms what my own family has long suspected but failed to properly address. Kale is the last surviving descendant of Ashwood Hollow's original bloodline, a claim considered more rightful by our kingdom's oldest and most binding laws than my own family's current position. The hall erupted into a chaos of overlapping voices, some nobles rising in visible outrage at the implications of Draven's admission, others watching Kale with newfound curiosity and calculation that suggested rapid recalculation of political loyalties already underway. Ilara stood close beside Kale throughout the tumult, feeling the tension radiating from him despite his outwardly composed demeanor. This is unprecedented, one noble called out, his voice cutting through the surrounding noise. Are you suggesting the throne itself should be reconsidered based on ancient claims few of us have even heard discussed openly before today? I am suggesting, Draven replied firmly, that a kingdom built upon buried injustice cannot claim true stability, regardless of how long that injustice remains hidden. I am not prepared to simply relinquish my position without proper consideration of what is fair and lawful, but neither am I prepared to continue perpetuating a lie that has already cost this man years of unjust suffering. As the assembled nobles continued to debate the implications loudly among themselves, Kale finally stepped forward, his voice carrying clearly across the hall despite its measured, controlled tone. I did not come to this kingdom seeking a throne, he said. I came because a woman chose to see something other than the monster your stories had made of me. Whatever claim my bloodline holds to this position, I have spent years surviving, simply to remain alive, not scheming to reclaim power I never fully understood was mine to begin with. The hall quieted somewhat at his words, many of the nobles clearly reconsidering their assumptions about the man they had expected to either demand immediate power or remain silently overwhelmed by the sudden revelation of his heritage. But, Kale continued, his voice hardening slightly, I will not allow the truth to remain buried simply because it proves inconvenient to those who benefited from its concealment. Lady Winifred's family orchestrated the destruction of my pack and the years of captivity that followed, all to protect a claim that history itself suggests was never rightfully theirs to protect. That truth deserves acknowledgement, regardless of what ultimately becomes of the throne itself. Draven studied him for a long moment, something complicated shifting behind his expression, respect mingling uneasily with the political uncertainty that clearly weighed heavily upon him now. Then let us address this properly, he said finally, turning back toward the assembled council. By ancient law, when a rightful claim resurfaces and is properly established through credible testimony and evidence, the matter must be settled through formal challenge, not through the chaos of court debate alone. I propose a blood rite, conducted openly before this council and witnessed by representatives from every noble family present, to settle definitively whether Kale's claim supersedes my own. The hall fell into stunned silence at the proposal, the weight of what Draven had just suggested settling heavily over everyone present. A blood rite, Ilara understood from what little she had learned of ancient Ashwood Hollow tradition, represented the most serious and binding method of resolving disputed claims to the throne, a formal contest between claimants that had not been invoked within living memory. Kale's eyes met Draven's steadily across the hall, something resolute settling into his expression despite the enormity of what had just been proposed. I accept, he said simply, his voice carrying clearly despite the murmurs already rippling through the assembled crowd. Alara felt her heart tighten with a mixture of pride and fear as she watched the two men who had begun this journey as captor and prisoner, now standing as equals before a formal challenge that would determine not only Chaol's fate, but the future of the entire kingdom that had spent 3 years believing him nothing more than a chained and muzzled monster. Whatever awaited them in the blood rite to come, both Alara and Chaol understood now that the truth, however long buried and however dangerous to those who had worked to conceal it, had finally found its way into the open, and there would be no returning to the silence that had defined the years before the choosing had brought them together. The blood rite was set to take place 3 days later, in the same courtyard where Alara had once walked past every safe, approved suitor to choose the chained man everyone else feared. The palace buzzed with restless anticipation throughout those 3 days, nobles and commoners alike whispering about the unprecedented challenge that would soon determine whether Ashwood Hollow's throne would remain with Draven's family or pass to the bloodline it had displaced generations earlier. Alara spent much of that time preparing alongside Chaol, though there was little she could offer in terms of physical preparation for a contest whose rules remained largely ceremonial and steeped in tradition older than either of them fully understood. Instead, she focused on ensuring he entered the rite with a clear mind, free from the doubt and suppressed trauma that had shadowed him since his years of captivity. "You do not need to prove anything to me," she told him quietly, the evening before the rite was set to begin, as they sat together near the same window where he had spent so many sleepless nights since the chains first came off. "Whatever happens tomorrow, whether you win this claim or not, I chose you already, and that has not changed." Chaol studied her carefully, something soft and unguarded crossing his features, an expression she had come to recognize over the weeks since the choosing, as entirely genuine, stripped of the careful control he maintained in front of everyone else. "I know," he said quietly, "but tomorrow is not only about us anymore. It is about every person my bloodline's silence has cost, about the truth finally being given the chance to stand openly rather than remain buried beneath fear and convenient stories." "Then stand tomorrow as exactly who you are," Alara said. "Not the monster the kingdom was taught to fear, and not simply a claimant to a throne you never asked for. Stand as the man who fought to protect me without losing himself, the man who has spent years surviving impossible circumstances, with more discipline and restraint than anyone gave him credit for." Chaol reached out, gently taking her hand in his, a gesture that would have seemed impossible weeks earlier when chains and fear defined every interaction between them. "Whatever happens tomorrow," he said, "I am grateful, more than words can properly convey, that you were the one who saw past everything the kingdom decided about me." The morning of the blood rite arrived cold and clear, the courtyard filled with far more spectators than had gathered even for the original choosing ceremony weeks earlier. Nobles from every corner of Ashwood Hollow's territories had gathered to witness the unprecedented contest, along with common folk drawn by curiosity and the significance of a challenge that had not occurred within living memory. Alara stood near the courtyard's edge alongside Grace and Owen, watching as Draven and Chaol took their positions at opposite ends of the circle, both men dressed simply, without ceremonial armor or elaborate weaponry, in accordance with the ancient traditions governing the rite. An elder from the council, a woman whose family had served as keepers of Ashwood Hollow's oldest laws for generations, stepped forward to address the assembled crowd. "The blood rite is not a contest of destruction," she announced, her voice carrying clearly across the silent courtyard. "It is a test of control, discipline, and worthiness, judged not merely by victory, but by the manner in which that victory is achieved. Both claimants understand the terms. Let the rite begin." Draven and Chaol approached the center of the circle, and Alara felt her breath catch as she watched the two men who had begun this journey, as king and prisoner, now facing one another as equals, each carrying decades of history that had led inevitably toward this moment. The contest that followed unfolded with an intensity that held the entire courtyard in tense, silent focus, neither man resorting to reckless aggression, both demonstrating a careful, measured skill that spoke to years of discipline honed through very different circumstances. Draven fought with the practiced precision of a man who had ruled through strength and calculated authority for over 2 decades, his movements confident and controlled. Yet as the contest progressed, Alara began to notice something shifting in the dynamic between them. A subtle but unmistakable difference in the way Chaol moved, not with the desperate survival instinct that had defined his earlier confrontations against hired attackers, but with something calmer, more assured, as though the truth finally spoken openly had freed something within him that years of chains and fear had kept carefully suppressed. When the decisive moment finally came, it arrived not through overwhelming force, but through the same controlled restraint that had first convinced Alara, weeks earlier, that the stories told about Chaol had never captured the whole truth. He disarmed Draven cleanly, decisively, yet without the brutal finality the crowd had perhaps expected from a man once described as a mindless monster. Instead, he stood over the king with his weapon lowered, offering a hand rather than a killing blow. The courtyard fell into stunned silence as Draven, breathing heavily from the exertion of the contest, looked up at the man who had just defeated him, recognizing in that gesture something that confirmed everything Hannah's testimony and the council's investigation had already suggested about Chaol's true character. "You could end this claim entirely, right now," Draven said quietly, his voice carrying just far enough for those nearest the circle to hear. "The right would permit it." "I did not enter this contest seeking your death," Gale replied, his voice steady and clear enough for the entire courtyard to hear. "I entered it seeking acknowledgement of a truth too long buried, and the chance to ensure no one else suffers as I did, simply because the truth proved inconvenient to those in power." The elder who had opened the ceremony stepped forward once more, her expression carrying the weight of witnessing something she clearly recognized as significant beyond the immediate outcome of the contest itself. "The blood right has been decided," she announced. "By ancient law, victory belongs to Chaol, last descendant of Ashwood Hollow's original bloodline. Yet the manner of that victory, tempered by mercy rather than vengeance, speaks to a character worthy of the throne he now rightfully claims." Draven rose slowly, accepting the outcome with a composure that Alara recognized as genuine rather than merely resigned. "Then I yield my claim," he said, addressing the assembled nobles rather than simply Chaol alone. "Not because the right demands it, though it does, but because I have witnessed in this contest a restraint and integrity that my own family's history, built upon silence and convenient injustice, cannot claim to match." The courtyard erupted into a mixture of stunned murmurs and, gradually, growing applause, as the significance of what had just occurred settled over the assembled crowd. Ilara moved quickly through the dispersing tension to reach Chaol's side, her heart full with a complicated mixture of relief, pride, and quiet astonishment at how far they had come since the night she had first walked past every safe suitor to choose the chained man everyone else feared. "You did it," she said softly, reaching for his hand. "We did it," Chaol corrected gently, his eyes carrying a warmth that had been entirely absent during their first meeting weeks earlier. "None of this would have been possible if you had chosen safety that night instead of me." In the weeks that followed, Chaol's coronation as Ashwood Hollow's rightful ruler proceeded with a careful blend of ancient tradition and practical necessity, ensuring the kingdom's stability remained intact despite the unprecedented shift in power. Draven, true to his word, accepted exile from the throne rather than harsher punishment, a mercy Chaol insisted upon despite the objections of several nobles who argued for stronger consequences given the years of injustice his family's silence had caused. Lady Winifred was eventually captured attempting to cross into a neighboring territory, her fate left to formal judgment before the same council that had witnessed the blood right, ensuring that the truth of her family's role in both the original bloodline dispute and the recent attacks would be properly and publicly addressed, rather than quietly buried as previous generations had allowed. As for Alara, she found herself standing beside Chaol during his formal coronation, not as a trophy claimed through victory, as some of the more skeptical nobles had initially assumed she might be treated, but as the woman whose willingness to see past fear and rumor had ultimately set in motion the truth's long overdue return to the light. When Chaol turned to her during the ceremony, taking her hand before the assembled crowd that had once watched her choose him in chains, his expression carried none of the guarded caution that had defined their earliest days together. "They expected you to choose safety," he said quietly, meant only for her ears despite the crowd surrounding them. "A weak rogue who would keep you comfortable and unnoticed. Instead, you chose the monster no one could control, and in doing so, you gave me back everything that had been stolen from me." "I did not choose a monster," Ilara replied softly, her eyes steady on his. "I chose the man beneath the chains, the one everyone else was too afraid to look for." As Ashwood Hollow's new king and the woman who had defied every expectation to stand beside him faced the assembled kingdom together, the courtyard that had once held its breath in fear now erupted into genuine celebration, marking not only the ascension of a rightful ruler long denied his heritage, but the quiet, unwavering courage of a woman who had refused to see the world exactly as everyone else insisted it should be seen. The kingdom that had once feared the man in chains now stood ready to follow him freely, understanding at last that the greatest strength had never lain in mindless power or inherited fear, but in the discipline and integrity to wield strength with mercy, and in the courage to choose truth over convenient silence, no matter how deeply that truth had been buried.